Former Detective Senior Constable Simon Arts is accused on several different counts of leaking information to the Australian's reporter Cameron Stewart about Operation Neath, which was a major anti-terrorism raid. And the Australian actually published information about that operation on the very morning that raids took place and arrests were made, back on the 4th of August 2009. So there were copies of the Australian available in Melbourne on the morning of the raids. The evidence has been at around 1:30, and the raids were due to begin at about 4:30 a.m. So there were a few hours in which the story was on the front page of the Australian, and yet raids hadn't taken place. And the then Victorian Police Commissioner Simon Overland was extremely critical of the Australian for that. He said that police officers' lives had been put at risk because of the possibility that the suspects would have been tipped off. All journalists like a scoop, and we all like to have it first, obviously. That's what a scoop is. But I suppose when you're talking about spiking a long-running and important police investigation, you then have to do a balancing of the public interests involved. Now, I've said in my commentary in Crikey that I don't think there was much public interest involved in the Australian having this scoop at that time, although as a journalist I can certainly understand the hunger for the news.
And Margaret Simons, who was on the show earlier, wrote that Paul had bargained with the lives with the AFP, bargain with lives about whether or not to run this story. Now, that's just not a fair characterisation, A, of what's gone on, and B, of the evidence. I mean, we're in the middle of a case here, and what the court heard on day one was lots of evidence from Tony Negus, the head of the AFP, about these very frank and difficult discussions that he had with Paul Whittaker at the time. But certainly Tony Negus never used the word, bargaining for lives, or the phrase bargaining for lives. That was never suggested by him. And the thing that's being lost in all this is that at the time those negotiations were going on, the Australian didn't know about the planned attack at the Holsworthy Army base. This is something that's been brushed over in a lot of the reporting of this case. We only had, Cameron Stewart, good reporter though he is, only had actually a small part of this story, and that was to do with the people living in Melbourne funneling funds overseas. What was being put to Mr Negus in court was testimony that he gave Ackley, the federal police watchdog, back in 2009, and in a statement that he sworn in 2010. Now, if people were sitting in the court and fairly looking at and listening to what he was saying, reading his body language, looking at some of the sentences that were getting cut off by the Defence Counsel, a lot of the sharper phrases of that testimony, for example, the fact that he thought the conduct was reprehensible, he's not saying that now, only agreeing that he said that then. There was a stuff-up with the circulation. It wasn't intended. We'd held off on that story in good faith for as long as the AFP wanted us to. We said to them, fine. Once we found out about, or even before we found out about Holsworthy, we agreed to hold off on the story until we got the go-ahead. We published on it on an agreed date. We kept it until last edition. We kept it offline. But there were some papers that got circulated to 7-Eleven.